February 23, 1945. Somewhere in the Arizona desert. The metal gate swings open with a hollow clang that echoes across the flat expanse of sand and scrubland. The air is dry, tasting of dust and creosote bush, and the February sun, though pale by Arizona standards, still burns white against an endless blue sky. A line of Japanese soldiers, still wearing the tattered remnants of their Imperial uniforms, shuffles forward in silence. Their hands are not bound, their heads are not forced down. They walk upright, but their eyes betray something deeper than exhaustion, something closer to confusion, perhaps even disbelief. They have been told they are prisoners of war. They have been told they will be held at a place called the Gila River War Relocation Center, repurposed now to house enemy combatants. What they have not been told, what they cannot yet comprehend, is that everything they believed about captivity, about dishonor, about the fate that awaited defeated soldiers, is about to unravel before them like a threadbare banner in the wind. One soldier, a young corporal named Takeshi Yamada, clutches a small wooden charm in his pocket, a gift from his mother before he left Yokohama 4 years ago. He has carried it through Guadalcanal, through the hell of Saipan, through the days of starvation and bombardment that ended with his surrender on a nameless ridge in the Philippines. He has carried it expecting never to see home again. The shame of surrender, drilled into him since boyhood, sits like a stone in his chest. In the Imperial Army, they had been taught that capture was worse than death, that a soldier who allowed himself to be taken alive had forfeited not only his honor, but his very humanity. Takeshi had seen what his own forces did to prisoners, the Chinese, the Filipinos, the occasional unlucky American or Australian. He had seen the casual brutality, the starvation, the labor unto death. He expects nothing less now. He expects to be worked until his bones break. He expects to be beaten. He expects, in some deep and unspoken part of himself, to be erased. But as the gates close behind him, and the American guards, armed but strangely relaxed, gesture for the prisoners to form up and move toward the barracks, something begins to crack in Takeshi's understanding of the world. The guards do not shout, they do not strike. One of them, a broad-shouldered sergeant with red hair and freckles, even offers a canteen of water to an older Japanese soldier who stumbles in the heat. The old man stares at the canteen as if it were a live grenade. He does not take it at first. He cannot reconcile the gesture with everything he knows. The sergeant shrugs, sets the canteen down on a wooden post, and walks away. The old man waits until the American is out of sight, then drinks deeply, his hands trembling. This is the moment, small, almost invisible in the vast machinery of the Second World War, that will ripple outward through the lives of thousands of Japanese prisoners of war held in American custody. It is a moment that will challenge the ideological bedrock of Imperial Japan, expose the chasm between propaganda and reality, and ultimately reveals something fundamental about the nature of the conflict itself. For the Japanese soldier, raised in a culture that prized death over dishonor and obedience over individual survival, the experience of American captivity would become a profound psychological rupture. And for the Americans, the treatment of Japanese POWs would become a quiet but powerful assertion of values, a demonstration that even in the crucible of total war, there were lines that would not be crossed, principles that would not be abandoned.
The road to this moment began long before the gates of Gila River swung open. It began in the decades of militarization and indoctrination that transformed Japan from a newly modernized nation into an empire driven by visions of racial superiority and divine destiny. The concept of Bushido, the way of the warrior, had been resurrected and weaponized by the imperial military, twisted from its feudal origins into a rigid code that demanded absolute loyalty, self-sacrifice, and a willingness to die rather than accept the shame of surrender. Japanese soldiers were taught from their earliest training that to be captured was to become horyo, a prisoner, a term so laden with disgrace that it was synonymous with losing one's soul. The Senjin-kun, the military code issued in 1941, made it explicit. Do not live in shame as a prisoner. Die to ensure you do not leave behind a bad name. This was not merely rhetoric, it was enforced through relentless psychological conditioning, through the public shaming of families whose sons were captured, through the erasure of prisoners' names from military rolls as if they had never existed. Japanese soldiers internalized this code so deeply that mass suicides became commonplace when defeat was imminent. On Saipan in July 1944, thousands of Japanese soldiers and civilians hurled themselves from cliffs rather than surrender to American forces. On Okinawa, the same grim ritual repeated itself, mothers clutching infants as they leaped into the sea, soldiers detonating grenades against their own chests. To the Western observer, such acts seemed incomprehensible, even inhuman. But to the Japanese soldier, they were the final expression of loyalty, the last gesture of honor in a world where honor was everything. And yet, despite this ideology, or perhaps because of it, the Imperial Japanese Army had no functional framework for treating prisoners of war with anything resembling humanity. The Geneva Conventions, signed by most of the world's major powers in 1929, had been deliberately rejected by Japan. The imperial government saw the conventions as a Western imposition, incompatible with Japanese values and military necessity. In practice, this meant that Allied prisoners in Japanese hands faced a nightmare of starvation, disease, forced labor, and casual murder. The Bataan Death March in 1942 saw 75,000 Filipino and American prisoners force-marched across the Philippine jungle. As many as 10,000 died en route, beaten, bayoneted, or shot if they fell behind. The construction of the Burma-Thailand Railway, immortalized in popular memory as the Death Railway, consumed the lives of over 12,000 Allied POWs and an estimated 90,000 Asian laborers, worked to death in conditions that defied description. Prisoners were fed starvation rations, often little more than a handful of rice per day, beaten for the smallest infractions, and denied medical care even as malaria, dysentery, and beriberi ravaged the camps. Survival rates in Japanese POW camps hovered around 60%. By comparison, survival rates for Allied prisoners in German camps were close to 96%. This was the context in which Japanese soldiers understood captivity. This was the mirror they held up to their own fate when they fell into American hands. They expected retribution. They expected the same merciless efficiency they had inflicted on others. They expected to disappear into the machinery of vengeance. What they found instead was something far stranger, far more disorienting. They found a system that, despite the rage and grief that fueled the American war effort, had chosen to adhere to international law. They found a system that insisted, even in the face of atrocity, that prisoners were still human beings. The first shock came with food. Takeshi Yamada, like most Japanese soldiers captured in the latter stages of the war, had spent months on the edge of starvation. Imperial supply lines had collapsed under the weight of American naval dominance, and by 1944, frontline Japanese units were subsisting on whatever they could scavenge: roots, grasses, insects, the occasional bit of hoarded rice. Soldiers joked grimly that they were fighting a war on empty stomachs. Many were so malnourished that their bodies began to consume themselves, muscles wasting away, teeth loosening, minds growing foggy with hunger. When Takeshi was captured, he weighed less than 90 pounds. His ribs stood out like the bars of a cage. He had not eaten a full meal in over 2 months. On his first night in American custody, he was given a tray in the mess hall. He stared at it, uncomprehending. White bread, butter, canned beef, boiled potatoes, a cup of coffee, fruit cocktail, and syrup. The portions were not lavish for American standards. This was wartime after all, and rations were carefully managed. But to Takeshi, it was an incomprehensible abundance. He looked around at the other prisoners, their faces gaunt and hollow, their hands shaking as they lifted forks to their mouths. Some ate slowly, reverently, as if the food might vanish if they moved too quickly. Others wept openly, unable to reconcile the reality before them with the fate they had imagined. One older prisoner, a sergeant who had fought in China and seen the worst of what the Imperial Army could do, refused to eat. He sat rigid at the table, staring at the tray, convinced it was poisoned, convinced it was a final cruelty to fill them with hope before the end came. It took 3 days before he touched the food. When he finally did, he ate in silence, tears streaming down his face, and said nothing to anyone afterward. This was not propaganda, this was policy. The United States, despite the fury of Pearl Harbor, despite the island-hopping carnage of the Pacific Campaign, despite the knowledge of what Japanese forces had done to American prisoners, had made a deliberate choice to honor the Geneva Conventions. President Roosevelt himself had issued a statement in 1942 affirming that the United States would treat all prisoners of war in accordance with international law, regardless of whether the enemy reciprocated. It was a decision rooted in both principle and pragmatism. Principle because the American military and political leadership believed that adherence to the rule of law was what separated civilization from barbarism. Pragmatism because violating the conventions would endanger American POWs held by the Axis and undermine the moral legitimacy of the Allied cause.
And so, Japanese prisoners in American camps received the same caloric ration as American soldiers, approximately 2,800 calories per day, adjusted for climate and labor. They were provided with medical care, vaccinations, treatment for wounds and disease, dental work. They were housed in barracks that, while Spartan, were weatherproof and equipped with heating or cooling as needed. They were allowed to receive mail, to practice their religion, to organize recreational activities. Some camps even provided Japanese language newspapers, sports equipment, and musical instruments. Prisoners were permitted to form self-governing committees, to elect leaders, to maintain a semblance of communal structure. Those who violated camp rules were subject to discipline, but that discipline was codified, predictable, and never arbitrary. There were no beatings, no torture, no executions for trivial infractions. To the Japanese prisoners, this was incomprehensible. It violated everything they had been taught about the nature of power, the inevitability of cruelty, the logic of war. Many assumed it was a trick, a temporary kindness designed to extract information or cooperation before the hammer fell. But as weeks turned into months and months into years, the hammer never fell. The food kept coming. The doctors kept treating the sick. The guards, for the most part, remained professional, distant, but not hostile. And slowly, painfully, the prisoners began to reckon with the possibility that shook them to their core, that the Americans were not pretending, that this was simply how they treated prisoners, that the ideology they had been taught, that strength meant domination, that mercy was weakness, that the individual had no value except in service to the state, was not universal, that it was, in fact, a lie. The transformation was neither immediate nor universal. Many prisoners, particularly those captured early in the war or those who had internalized the imperial ideology most deeply, resisted this new reality with every fiber of their being. They clung to the belief that death was preferable to dishonor, that cooperation with the enemy was treason, that acceptance of kind treatment was a betrayal of the emperor. In some camps, hard-line prisoners formed secret councils enforcing discipline through intimidation and violence. Those who accepted American authority too readily, who learned English or volunteered for work details, were branded as traitors, Inu, dogs. There were beatings in the dead of night, threats whispered in the latrines, a climate of fear that mirrored the authoritarianism of the Imperial Army itself. But over time, cracks appeared in this resistance. The younger prisoners, many of whom had been conscripted late in the war and had never fully embraced the ideology, began to question. They saw the way American guards treated them, not as subhuman, but as adversaries who had been defeated and who now deserved a measure of respect. They saw the medical staff working tirelessly to save the lives of prisoners ravaged by malaria and dysentery, even though those same prisoners might have killed Americans just weeks before. They saw the chaplains who came to the camps offering spiritual comfort without demanding conversion. And they began to wonder if the Americans were truly the demonic barbarians they had been taught to fear. Why were they not acting like it? One prisoner, a former school teacher named Hiroshi Tanaka, later wrote in his memoir about the day he realized the depth of the deception he had lived under. It was a small moment, a guard sharing a cigarette with him during a work detail, asking about his family back in Japan, expressing genuine sympathy when Hiroshi admitted he did not know if they had survived the air raids. The guard had lost a brother at Iwo Jima. Hiroshi had lost a cousin at Midway. For a brief moment, they were not enemies. They were simply two men, shaped by the same war, mourning the same losses. Hiroshi wrote, "I had been told that Americans had no honor, no concept of duty or sacrifice. But in that moment, I saw a man who carried his grief with dignity, who did not hate me despite every reason to do so. I realized then that everything I had believed was built on sand." This psychological shift was accelerated by exposure to American abundance, an abundance that extended far beyond food. Prisoners witnessed the casual efficiency of American logistics, the endless flow of supplies, the mechanization and organization that characterized every aspect of the war effort. They saw trucks and jeeps and planes in numbers that dwarfed anything the Imperial Army had ever fielded. They saw the ease with which broken equipment was replaced, the lack of desperation, the sense that for the Americans, the war was not a struggle for survival, but a problem to be solved through industrial might and organizational discipline. For soldiers who had fought on half rations, with obsolete equipment and no hope of reinforcement, this was a revelation. It became clear that Japan had not lost because her soldiers lacked courage, or because the emperor had withdrawn his favor. Japan had lost because it had challenged an enemy whose resources and productive capacity were so overwhelming that the outcome had never truly been in doubt.
The symbolic weight of this realization cannot be overstated. Japanese propaganda had painted the war as a spiritual struggle, a clash of civilizations in which Japanese purity and discipline would triumph over Western decadence and materialism. The reality of American POW camps, where even prisoners ate better than frontline Japanese soldiers, where waste was so abundant that food was sometimes thrown away, where individuals were treated as having inherent worth regardless of their utility to the state, demolished that narrative. It forced prisoners to confront the possibility that their sacrifices had been in vain, that the ideology that demanded their deaths had been a grotesque miscalculation. For some, this reckoning led to despair. Suicide attempts, though less common than in combat, still occurred in the camps. Men who could not reconcile their shame with their survival, who could not bear the weight of having betrayed the code of Bushido, found ways to end their lives, hanging themselves in the barracks, refusing food until their bodies gave out, provoking guards in the desperate hope of being shot. The American authorities, aware of this risk, implemented watch protocols and psychological evaluations, though the resources for such care were limited. Many prisoners simply withdrew, becoming shadows of themselves, silent and unresponsive, waiting for the war to end so they could return to Japan and face whatever judgment awaited them. But for others, the experience became a strange kind of liberation. Freed from the crushing weight of imperial ideology, from the constant surveillance and brutal discipline of the Japanese military, they began to explore aspects of themselves that had been suppressed for years.
They read books from the camp libraries, American novels, translations of Western philosophy, texts on democracy and individual rights. They attended educational classes organized by the camp administration, learning English, studying American history, debating ideas that would have been unthinkable in Imperial Japan. Some discovered talents they had never known they had: art, music, craftsmanship. Camp workshops produced intricate carvings, paintings, musical performances that reflected a creativity unshackled from the rigid conformity of military life. There was, of course, an element of American psychological warfare in all of this. The Office of War Information and military intelligence agencies saw the POW camps as opportunities to reshape Japanese attitudes, to plant the seeds of post-war democratization. Educational programs emphasized the superiority of democratic governance, the failures of militarism, the virtues of individual freedom. Films were shown depicting American life, its prosperity, its diversity, its commitment to justice. Some prisoners dismissed this as propaganda, and in many ways it was. But propaganda, like all persuasion, is most effective when it contains a kernel of truth. And the truth was that the contrast between American treatment of prisoners and Japanese treatment of prisoners spoke louder than any film or lecture ever could. By the time the war ended in August 1945, there were over 5,000 Japanese prisoners of war held in camps across the United States. Their mortality rate was less than 2%, a stark contrast to the 40% mortality rate of Allied prisoners in Japanese hands. When the surrender was announced, the reaction among Japanese POWs was mixed. Some felt relief. Some felt renewed shame, knowing they would have to return to a defeated nation and face the stigma of having survived when so many had died. Some, particularly the younger prisoners, felt a strange sense of gratitude, not to the United States as a nation, but to the individuals who had treated them with unexpected decency. One prisoner, in a letter smuggled out of the camp and later published in a Japanese newspaper, wrote, "I do not know what awaits me in Japan. I do not know if I will be forgiven, but I know that in this place I was treated not as an animal, but as a man, and that is something I will carry with me for the rest of my life." The repatriation process was slow and fraught with uncertainty. Many prisoners feared what awaited them at home. Japan, after all, was a nation in ruins, its cities burned, its economy shattered, its population traumatized by the atomic bombings and the sudden collapse of the imperial dream. Returning soldiers faced suspicion and hostility, particularly those who had surrendered rather than dying in battle. Families disowned sons who had been taken prisoner. Employers refused to hire them. Some former POWs changed their names, moved to remote regions, tried to erase the stain of captivity from their histories. But slowly, over the years, the stigma began to fade. As Japan rebuilt under American occupation, as democratic reforms took hold, as the ideology of militarism was dismantled and discredited, the experiences of former POWs began to take on a different meaning. Some became advocates for reconciliation, speaking publicly about their time in American camps and the lessons they had learned about human dignity and the rule of law. Hiroshi Tanaka, the former school teacher, became a prominent educator in post-war Japan, teaching his students about the importance of critical thinking and the dangers of blind obedience to authority. Takeshi Yamada, the young corporal who had clutched his mother's charm through the gates of Gila River, returned to Yokohama and opened a small bookstore where he sold translations of American literature and quietly encouraged young Japanese to question the narratives they were fed. These were small victories, individual transformations in the vast sweep of history, but they mattered. They mattered because they demonstrated that even in the midst of total war, even in the face of profound ideological conflict, it was possible to choose humanity over cruelty, principle over expedience. The American treatment of Japanese POWs was not perfect. There were instances of neglect, moments of harshness, biases that could not be fully erased, but on the whole, it represented a commitment to values that transcended the immediate demands of the conflict. It was a declaration that civilization, however fragile, however contested, was worth defending, not just in victory, but in the treatment of the defeated.
April 12, 1946, San Francisco Harbor. The ship rocks gently at the pier, its hull scarred by the long journey across the Pacific. On the deck, a group of repatriated Japanese prisoners stand in silence, watching the American skyline recede as the vessel prepares to depart. Among them is Takeshi Yamada, older now, his uniform exchanged for civilian clothes provided by the Red Cross. He holds the wooden charm his mother gave him, worn smooth by years of handling. He does not know if she is alive. He does not know what kind of Japan he is returning to. But he knows something he did not know when he first walked through the gates of Gila River, that the world is not as simple as he was taught, that enemies can act with honor, that mercy is not weakness, but a kind of strength that empires built on cruelty can never understand. As the ship pulls away from the dock, an American officer on the pier raises his hand in a brief salute. It is not a gesture of friendship exactly, too much blood has been spilled for that, but it is a gesture of recognition, of closure, of the acknowledgement that the war, with all its horrors, is over, and that both sides must now find a way to live in the world they have made. Takeshi returns the salute, a slow, deliberate motion, and as the Golden Gate Bridge rises in the distance, red against the morning fog, he thinks of all the men who did not make it this far, the ones who died on nameless islands, the ones who took their own lives rather than face dishonor, the ones who starved in the jungles because their commanders valued ideology over survival. He thinks of the guard who shared a cigarette with Hiroshi Tanaka, of the doctor who saved his life from dysentery, of the cook who always made sure there was enough rice, even when supplies ran low. He thinks of the food, the absurd, overwhelming abundance of it, the symbol of a nation that could afford to feed its enemies while its own sons fought and died on distant shores. And he understands, finally, what that abundance represented. It was not just material wealth, it was a choice to believe that even in war, even in the darkest moments, some things remained sacred, that a prisoner was still a human being, that the defeated still deserved dignity, that the measure of a nation was not only in how it treated its own, but in how it treated those it had every reason to despise. The ship turns south toward the open Pacific, and Takeshi returns the charm back into his pocket. He does not know what the future holds. He does not know if Japan will rise from the ashes or if it will be consumed by them. But he knows that he has seen something rare in this world, a glimpse of what it means to wage war without losing one's humanity. And that, he thinks, is worth carrying home. That is worth remembering. As the American coast fades to a thin line on the horizon, the sound of the ship's horn echoes across the water, low and mournful, a final note in the symphony of a war that has ended, but whose reverberations will be felt for generations. And in that sound, Takeshi hears not just the closing of a chapter, but the opening of a question that every soldier, every nation must eventually answer. What do we become when the fighting stops? Do we carry forward the cruelty we have witnessed, or do we choose something better? Do we honor the dead by perpetuating the hatred that killed them, or by building a world where their sacrifices might mean something more than endless cycles of vengeance? The answer for Takeshi and for thousands like him has already been written, not in grand declarations or treaties, but in small acts of unexpected kindness, in the choice to see the enemy as human, in the simple, revolutionary act of offering water to a man who expected only death.
It is an answer that will shape the post-war world, that will influence the rebuilding of Japan, that will echo through decades of diplomacy and reconciliation. It is an answer that proves, against all odds, that even in the crucible of total war, the best of what it means to be human can endure. The ship sails on, carrying its cargo of transformed men towards an uncertain future. And behind them, the city of San Francisco gleams in the spring sunlight, a monument to the strange, painful, necessary truth that sometimes the greatest victories are not won on the battlefield, but in the choices we make when the battle is over. This is the legacy of the American POW camps. Not a story of saints and sinners, not a tale of moral superiority, but a testament to the fragile, resilient conviction that law and compassion matter, even when, especially when, everything else has fallen apart. It is a reminder that the values we claim to uphold are only real if we uphold them in the hardest moments, when the temptation to abandon them is strongest. And it is a challenge, passed down through the decades, to every generation that inherits the memory of war, to remember not just the fighting, but the restraint, not just the victory, but the humanity that made it meaningful. The wooden charm sits in Takeshi's pocket, a small, silent witness to the journey he has made. And somewhere in the distance, beyond the horizon, Japan waits, broken, humbled, but not beyond redemption. The war is over. The real work of building peace has only just begun.